He shielded the alien queen from a hail of arrows, and she changed his fate. Forever, Callen Voss had never considered himself a hero. Mercenary work didn't breed sentimentality, only survival. Raised among the ash-stained ruins of forgotten wars, he had learned early that loyalty was a currency too easily spent and rarely returned. On Velmora, a world torn apart by endless civil strife between alien factions and human colonists, Callen had carved a reputation as a blade for hire, a man whose allegiance could be bought for the right price and whose conscience had long since been traded for better armor and heavier weapons. When the summons came to escort Queen Saris of the Luminari across enemy-controlled wastelands to the distant stronghold of Calem's Reach, Callen had accepted without hesitation, pocketing the heavy satchel of gems without a second thought. He didn't care that the Queen's survival was crucial to the fragile hopes of her dying people. He didn't care that assassins prowled every ridge and hollow, thirsty for royal blood. She was just another job, another contract, and once it was fulfilled, he would vanish into the stars, leaving Velmora's endless wars behind him. At least, that was the plan. It was a bitter dawn when they set out, the sky a molten smear of violet and gold, and already Callen could feel unseen eyes tracking their progress. The queen rode beside him astride a luminous steed bred for the deserts, her posture impossibly regal despite the danger pressing in on them. Saris was unlike any monarch Callen had ever seen. No haughty arrogance in her bearing, no cold distance in her pale, luminescent eyes. Instead, there was a quiet dignity about her, a sorrow wrapped in strength that made her seem almost too fragile for the brutal world she ruled. Callen ignored the flicker of respect sparking in his chest. Feelings had no place in a mercenary's heart. Yet as the hours passed and the harsh sun climbed higher, the strange companionship between them grew, carried on brief conversations, half-shared smiles, and a mutual understanding that trust between strangers was a rare and dangerous thing. They crossed salt flats where the ground cracked like brittle bone beneath their feet, forded poisoned rivers whose waters hissed with hidden venom, and skirted the edges of ancient battlegrounds littered with the rusted bones of forgotten machines. Each mile they traveled felt like a silent defiance against the death that shadowed them. It wasn't until they reached the jagged ravines of Veridan's Maw that the ambush came. One moment, all was stillness. The next, a shriek of war horns shattered the silence and a rain of arrows darkened the sky. Without thinking, without hesitation, Callen moved. Later, he would not recall making a conscious choice, only that the instant he heard the whistle of death through the air, his body acted on some primal instinct. He lunged at Saris, shoving her down into the shallow hollow of rock and throwing himself atop her, his arms caging her head, his body a shield against the mortal storm. Arrows thudded into the dirt around them, a brutal percussion that sent shards of stone flying. Pain exploded through him as a shaft pierced the armor at his shoulder, another slamming into the meat of his thigh. He grunted but did not falter. Overhead, the sky was a jagged tapestry of death, but Callen only cared about the woman trembling beneath him, her wide silver eyes staring up at him in stunned horror. More arrows rained down, one grazing his ribs, another embedding itself in the leather plating strapped across his back. The weight of the impacts drove him closer to Saris, and he could feel her breath hitching in panic. Blood soaked his tunic hot and wet, but he gritted his teeth and bore it, every muscle straining to stay upright, to protect, to endure. Time stretched impossibly long, a twisted mockery of seconds that felt like lifetimes. Somewhere, in the haze of agony, he heard the enemy warriors' cries, the pounding of boots over broken earth. He shifted, one hand fumbling for the hilt of his sword, prepared to fight if they closed in, prepared to die if he must, so long as Saris lived. But then, a sudden roar of answering voices rose from the cliffs above. The Queen's loyal guards, delayed by the treacherous terrain, now pouring down the ravine like a tide of steel. The attackers faltered, momentarily caught between their prey and the oncoming fury, and Callen seized the moment. With a ragged shout, he pushed himself up, sheltering Saris behind him, sword flashing as he parried an arrow mid-flight and struck down a charging enemy who had gotten too close. Blood, alien and human, splattered the rocks, and Callen fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. Eventually, the tide turned. The attackers broke and fled, scattering into the wastelands, leaving behind their dead and dying. As silence reclaimed the ravine, Callen staggered, swaying like a man drunk on blood and exhaustion. His sword slipped from numb fingers, clattering uselessly to the stone. Saris caught him as he fell, her arms surprisingly strong, her voice a desperate whisper against his ear, speaking words he could not understand but felt in the marrow of his bones. He tried to speak, to tell her it was all right, that he had kept his promise, but darkness rose up to claim him, thick and suffocating. His last conscious thought was the feel of her hand, warm and trembling, pressed over his heart, as if willing it to keep beating. As Callen slipped into unconsciousness, he realized with distant clarity that something profound had shattered inside him. Not a bone, not a muscle, but a belief. For the first time in a long, brutal life, he had acted not for gold, not for survival, but for someone else. And in doing so, he had glimpsed a sliver of something he had long forgotten. Honor, loyalty, maybe even redemption. Whether he lived or died, he knew one thing with aching certainty. His life was no longer his own. It belonged to the woman he had shielded, the queen he had bled for, the cause he had not even known he had until he risked everything to protect it. And somehow, in some way he could not yet name, he understood that his fate, for better or worse, had changed forever. When Callen Voss opened his eyes, he was adrift in a world that felt both alien and achingly serene, a place so removed from the blood and smoke of the battlefield that for a moment he wondered if he had died and been ferried to some soldier's afterlife. The ceiling above him shimmered with soft bioluminescent patterns, glowing tendrils that swirled like living constellations across a canvas of deep velvet. The air itself was perfumed with a scent he could not name, something crisp and electric, tinged with a sweetness that filled his lungs and made the pain ebb just slightly. Callen tried to move, but a protest of agony rippled through every fiber of his body, pinning him to the silk-draped bed on which he lay. His hands, rough and calloused from years of sword work, were swathed in fine, iridescent wrappings that pulsed faintly with healing energy. Bandages traced his ribs, his thighs, his arms, each one stitched not by thread but by something far older, something woven with the whisper of luminary magic. He blinked sluggishly, memories returning in fragments. The shriek of arrows, the shuddering impact against his armor, the queen's stunned face inches from his own, and the final collapse into darkness. He was alive, though he could not fathom how. As if sensing his awakening, a figure stirred beside him. Queen Saris sat vigil at his bedside, her regal composure frayed by sleepless nights and raw emotion. Her crown, a delicate circlet of woven crystalline starlight, lay discarded on the low table nearby, and her robes, once immaculate, were wrinkled and stained. Yet to Callen's dazed mind, she had never looked more radiant, more achingly real. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke, the silence between them thick with unspoken things. It was Saris who finally broke it, her voice low and rough from disuse. "You should not have survived," she said. And though the words were simple, they carried a tremor of wonder, of disbelief. Callen attempted a wry smile, but it twisted into a grimace of pain. "Story of my life," he rasped, his throat dry as dust. Saris leaned forward, a goblet of cool, crystalline water pressed gently to his lips. He drank greedily, the liquid tasting of ice and purity, and when he finally sagged back against the pillows, the queen remained close, her hand hovering just above his heart, as if to reassure herself that it still beat. "You threw yourself into death for me," she whispered, not as a question but as a statement of fact, and there was something in her voice, something raw and vulnerable, that Callen had never expected to hear from a monarch. He shrugged, or tried to, only to wince as the motion tugged at half-healed wounds. "It was a job," he muttered, but even he could hear the hollowness of the words. Saris smiled then, a small sorrowful curve of her lips. "No, it was not." She rose, pacing slowly across the chamber, her steps soundless against the polished stone floor that glowed faintly beneath her bare feet. You chose to protect me when you could have fled. You chose to endure pain meant for me. That is not something that can be bought with gold or promised with power. Callen closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a second skin. He had no answer because, deep down, he knew she spoke the truth. Whatever instincts had driven him in that moment of peril, they had not been mercenary. Once they had been human, flawed, noble, dangerous. In the days that followed, Callen's body began the slow, grueling process of mending, aided by the Luminari's ancient healing arts. He learned that the arrows had pierced deep, severing muscles, shattering bone, and yet somehow, through a mixture of primitive resilience and alien magic, he had been dragged back from the brink. His survival became a quiet legend among the palace whispers, spoken of in reverent tones by servants and guards alike. The Queen's champion, they called him, though Callen scoffed at the title whenever it reached his ears. He was no champion. He was just a man who had made a choice he didn't fully understand. Yet Saris never treated him like a symbol or a pawn. She visited him daily, sometimes bringing strange fruits that burst with flavor in his mouth, sometimes simply sitting in silence, her presence a balm to the restless turmoil gnawing at him. In those stolen hours, Callen began to see beyond the crown, beyond the regal facade, into the heart of the woman herself. She spoke of her people's struggle, the centuries of oppression they had suffered, the warlords who sought to erase their existence, the desperate hope she clung to like a drowning sailor clings to a shard of driftwood. She confided her dreams of rebuilding Velmora, not as a fractured wasteland of feuding tribes, but as a beacon of unity, a testament to survival against impossible odds. And Callen, who had spent his life believing in nothing, found himself listening, truly listening, in a way he had not done in years. In return, he told her pieces of his own story, not the polished lies he fed employers, but the raw, ugly truth. The boy who had scavenged from corpses to survive. The young man who had sold his sword to the highest bidder because it was easier, than hoping for something better. The scars he bore, not just on his skin, but in the hollow spaces inside him where faith and love should have lived. Saris never judged him. She simply listened, her eyes reflecting not pity, but understanding. Slowly, painfully, trust began to grow between them, tentative as a sprouting seed pushing through barren soil. When Callen was finally strong enough to walk again, albeit with a pronounced limp, Saris insisted on aiding him herself, her delicate hands steady beneath his arm as she guided him through the moonlit gardens of the palace. The air was rich, with the scent of blooming aurora vines, their petals humming softly in the cool night breeze. Under the silver glow of Velmora's twin moons, the world seemed fragile, almost sacred. And for the first time, Callen dared to believe that perhaps it was worth fighting for. His scars remained, angry red welts across his torso and limbs, but he wore them without shame. They were reminders of the choice he had made, and the woman for whom he had made it. In the privacy of his mind, he admitted that he would make the same choice again without hesitation. Something unspoken but potent simmered between him and Saris, a connection forged not from politics or duty, but from the raw, shared experience of survival and sacrifice. He saw it in the way her gaze lingered on him a moment too long, in the way her fingers brushed his hand when she thought he wasn't looking. He felt it in the way his own heart quickened when she smiled, a rare, unguarded smile that transformed her from a queen into something infinitely more precious, a woman willing to trust, willing to hope. Yet neither of them dared name it. Not yet. There were still battles to fight, enemies to face, and a world to heal. There was still too much blood on their hands, too many ghosts whispering in the night. But in those fleeting moments, Callen Voss understood something he had never grasped before. He had not merely saved Queen Saris's life on that battlefield. She had saved his soul. Bit by bit, she was rebuilding him, not as a weapon, but as a man worthy of something greater than coin and contracts. And though he could not yet see the full shape of the future awaiting them, he knew, with a certainty that burned brighter than any wound, that he would walk beside her into whatever storms lay ahead. Scarred, yes, but no longer broken, no longer lost. He had found a cause. He had found her, and he would never let go. The transformation of Callen Voss from mercenary to guardian was not immediate, nor was it without pain. It was a slow forging, like iron hammered relentlessly on an anvil, reshaped by fire and will, and it began in earnest the day Cirrus summoned him to the Council of Elders. He had regained enough of his strength to stand unaided, though the deep ache of his healing wounds reminded him with every breath of the price he had paid. Dressed not in battered armor but in a ceremonial tunic of deep midnight blue, its fabric woven with threads of light that shimmered with each movement, Callen felt exposed, vulnerable, more warrior than courtier. The palace halls echoed with a solemn hush as he followed Cirrus through towering arches and along bridges suspended over pools of still, luminous water, the alien beauty of the luminary stronghold breathtaking even to a man who had seen the wonders and horrors of 100 worlds. They entered the council chamber, a vast circular room where the ceiling opened to the endless sky, and the walls were etched with the living history of the luminary in spiraling reliefs. The elders waited there, ancient and regal, their translucent skin glowing faintly with the inner light that marked their lineage. Their eyes, as silver as starlight, regarded Callen with a mixture of skepticism and awe. At the center of the chamber, Cirrus stood tall, her presence commanding yet filled with a fierce grace, and when she spoke, her voice rang clear and unflinching across the marble floor. She told them of the ambush, of Callen's sacrifice, of how a man with no loyalty to crown or creed had chosen to shield their queen with nothing but his body and his courage. She told them that Callen Voss was no longer a mere sword for hire, but something rarer, a protector chosen not by bloodline or tradition, but by fate itself. The council listened in silence, their expressions unreadable, and Callen could feel the weight of their judgment settling over him like a tangible force. Part of him wanted to scoff, to turn on his heel and walk away, to reject the idea that he needed anyone's approval. But another part, the part Cirrus had awakened, held him rooted in place, chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. When Cirrus finished, an elder with hair like spun platinum and robes heavy with the sigils of her station rose to speak. Her voice was soft yet carried a steely edge. "Actions speak louder than blood oaths," she said. "But loyalty must be proven. Not once, but time and again. Will you, Callen Voss, swear yourself to the service of Velmora and its queen, not for gold, not for glory, but for the bond that was forged in blood and sacrifice?" Callen looked at Cirrus then, truly looked at her, not as a queen commanding allegiance, but as a woman offering trust, and something within him, something deeper than pride or stubbornness, responded. He dropped to one knee, his head bowed low. "I swear it," he said, his voice rough but certain. "By the blood I have spilled and the life I owe, I am hers to command." A ripple of murmured approval stirred the air, and Callen felt the invisible weight of the council's judgment lift slightly, though he knew it was not yet erased. Trust earned on a battlefield was a beginning, not a victory. From that day forward, Callen's life changed in ways he could never have foreseen. He was granted the title of Sarathi, the Queen's Shield, an honor that had not been bestowed on an outsider in centuries. With it came duties he had never imagined, the training of palace guards in techniques both alien and human, the oversight of security for Cirrus's travels and negotiations, the constant silent presence at her side during court gatherings and clandestine meetings with rebel factions who still hesitated to bend the knee. Through it all, Callen adapted, molded by necessity and by a stubborn refusal to be anything less than the man Cirrus believed he could become. Yet even as he learned the language of politics and diplomacy, his heart remained bound to the battlefield, to the raw honesty of combat where intentions could not be masked behind pretty words. And it was a good thing, too, because peace on Velmora was still a fragile, flickering candle, and shadows gathered beyond the reach of Cirrus's vision. It was during one such council, on a night heavy with the scent of impending rain, that word came of an assassination plot. A splinter faction of Luminari, bitter at the idea of unity with the human colonists, had sworn to see Cirrus dead before she could broker the fragile alliances needed to save their world. The threat was not mere rumor. It carried the weight of stolen intelligence, intercepted communications, and the grim certainty that somewhere within the palace itself, a blade waited to strike. Callen reacted without hesitation. He doubled the Queen's guard, posted sentinels in places no one had considered vulnerable, and personally swept her chambers each night with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. He slept lightly, often seated just beyond her door, his sword within reach. Though Saris protested, insisting she could not rule behind walls of fear, Callen refused to yield. "You are hope itself," he told her one night as the rain beat a relentless tattoo against the windows, "and hope must be guarded." It was in those long, tense nights that the unspoken bond between them grew tighter, pulled taut by shared danger and quiet understanding. Sometimes, when exhaustion dulled her defenses, Saris would sit beside him and speak in low, hurried tones about her dreams for Velmora, the libraries she wished to rebuild, the healing centers she wanted to open, the songs she longed to hear echo across the valleys once more instead of the wails of war. And Callen would listen, his heart aching with a fierce protectiveness he had no words to express. He realized then that he was no longer protecting a queen merely out of duty or honor. He was protecting a future he wanted to see, a dream he had come to believe in as fiercely as she did. The assassination attempt came sooner than anyone anticipated. It was during a diplomatic feast meant to cement an alliance with the border clans, an event brimming with laughter and masked resentment, that the assassin struck. Disguised as a servant, he moved through the throng with deadly grace, a slim, curved blade hidden beneath a tray of jeweled fruits. Callen's instincts screamed even before he saw the glint of steel. He moved, fast as a striking hawk, intercepting the assassin just as the blade arced toward Saris's unprotected back. Metal met metal with a shower of sparks as Callen's sword caught the deadly strike and chaos erupted. Guards surged forward, guests screamed and fled, but Callen's world narrowed to the assassin alone, a blur of shadow and fury. They fought in a brutal, savage dance, blades flashing, feet sliding across the polished marble floor slick with spilled wine. Callen took a shallow cut across his ribs, another nick at his forearm, but he pressed forward with relentless, cold determination. Finally, with a roar, he disarmed the would-be killer and slammed him to the ground, the assassin's wrist snapping with a sickening crack. The man snarled curses in a guttural dialect, but Callen only tightened his grip until the struggling ceased. When he looked up, Saris stood over them, her face pale but composed, her eyes locked on Callen with an intensity that stole the breath from his lungs. "You saved me again," she said softly, and though the room swirled with fear and fury, Callen's world was centered solely on her. "Always," he murmured, a promise not just for tonight but for all the nights and days yet to come. Later, as the assassin was dragged away for questioning and the court attempted to stitch its dignity back together, Saris pulled Callen aside into a quiet alcove away from prying eyes. Her hands framed his face, delicate but unyielding, and she leaned close enough that he could see the reflection of his own scars in her eyes. "You are more than my shield, Callen Voss," she whispered. "You are my heart's defender." Before he could speak, before reason or fear could intervene, she pressed her forehead to his, a silent, sacred luminary gesture of trust and devotion. And in that moment, beneath the weeping skies of Velmora, Callen realized that his journey had only just begun. He was not merely guarding a queen anymore. He was guarding the woman he loved, and the fragile, fierce dream they would build together from the ashes of a broken world. The days that followed the assassination attempt unfurled, like a tapestry woven from tension and whispered fears, the once shining halls of the palace now cloaked in a heavy silence that no amount of light could chase away. And though Queen Saris maintained a facade of calm strength for her people, behind closed doors she and Callen Voss prepared for a storm that would not be averted by vigilance alone. The failed assassin had revealed under interrogation what Callen had already suspected. The attempt on Saris's life was no isolated act of desperation, but the opening salvo of a far greater rebellion, a meticulously orchestrated uprising led by the Sons of the Shattered Star, a radical sect of luminary purists who believed their race's salvation lay not in unity, but in annihilation of all who did not share their blood. They had infiltrated the capital with ruthless precision, seeding discontent among the clans, bribing soldiers, sabotaging food supplies, and waiting, always waiting, for the perfect moment to strike at the heart of Velmora's fragile rebirth. That moment had nearly arrived. The intelligence Cirrus and Callen gathered painted a grim picture. Within days, the Suns would launch a coordinated attack from within the city itself, igniting chaos while their forces swept in from the mountains, under cover of darkness. Velmora would fall, Cirrus would die, and all dreams of peace would be ground to ash beneath their boots. The Council of Elders, though fearful, was paralyzed by tradition and caution, debating endlessly while precious hours slipped away. And so it fell to Cirrus and Callen to act in secret, gathering a small, fiercely loyal band of warriors willing to fight for a future they might never live to see. Each night, Callen drilled them in brutal, silent drills, molding farmers, scribes, and young soldiers into a blade sharp enough to pierce the heart of the coming darkness. Cirrus, too, was tireless, forging alliances with border tribes and exiles, long thought lost, weaving a web of hope across the broken lands. Callen watched her work with a mixture of awe and terror, not because she wavered, but because she did not. Because she bore the weight of so many lives without faltering even as the cost carved itself deeper into her soul. He loved her then, not as a distant sovereign draped in silk and ceremony, but as a woman who stood unbowed against the storm, fierce and luminous, and heartbreakingly mortal. The night before the final battle dawned, Callen found Cirrus alone, in the ancient Temple of Stars, standing before a pool of still water that mirrored the broken constellations above. She wore no crown, no armor, only a simple gown that clung to her like mist. And when she turned to him, there was no queen in her gaze. Only Cirrus, the woman he had nearly died to protect, the woman he would die for without hesitation. Neither spoke. Words had long since become unnecessary between them. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, cupping her face between his scarred hands, and she leaned into his touch with a sigh that trembled with exhaustion and longing. Their kiss was not the desperate clash of lovers at the end of the world, but something deeper, more sacred, a binding of souls, a promise spoken not in oaths but in breath and blood. When they parted, Cirrus rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady drumbeat of his heart, and for a brief, stolen moment, the world beyond the temple ceased to exist. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice so soft he barely caught it. "Whatever happens, know this. You have already saved me, Callen Voss. You gave me back my will to dream." He pressed a kiss to her hair, closing his eyes against the fierce ache in his chest. "And you gave me something worth fighting for," he murmured. When the sun rose blood-red over Velmora's jagged peaks, Callen stood at the Queen's side, armored not just in steel but in purpose, his small force arrayed behind him. The city was eerily silent, the streets abandoned, the markets shuttered, as if holding its breath before the storm broke. Then the first horn sounded, a low, mournful note that echoed through the stone valleys, and the sons of the shattered star descended from the hills like a plague of locusts, banners of obsidian, and crimson snapping in the rising wind. The battle erupted with the fury of a world scorned by peace. Arrows blackened the sky, swords rang against shields, and the air filled with the screams of the dying. Callen fought like a man possessed, carving a path through the chaos, never straying far from Cirrus, whose own blade sang a song of vengeance and hope. Time blurred, became meaningless, a series of flashes, the wide-eyed terror of a boy barely older than a squire as he lunged with a dagger, the bone-jarring impact of an axe against Callen's shield, the sudden bloom of blood as an enemy fell gurgling at his feet. Twice he was knocked to the ground, and twice he rose again, fueled not by rage but by an indomitable refusal to let Cirrus's light be extinguished. Their side fought valiantly, but the suns were legion, and slowly, inevitably, the tide began to turn against them. By dusk the palace gates had been breached, the defenders driven back to the inner sanctum where Cirrus had been crowned. It was there, in the heart of her kingdom, that Ceres made her stand, rallying the last of her warriors into a circle around the sacred dais. Callen knew they could not hold out forever. The suns were too many, too ruthless, and unless something changed, Ceres would fall, and Velmora with her. But Ceres had one last gambit, one last desperate hope. She turned to Callen, her face pale but resolute, and pressed something into his hand, a small crystalline shard, humming with latent energy. "The Heartstone," she said, breathless. "Take it to the wellspring. If it is restored to the waters, it will awaken the city's ancient defenses. It's our only chance." Callen hesitated, torn between the command and the instinct to stay by her side. She saw his struggle, and her hand tightened on his. "You are my shield, Callen," she said, fierce and tender. "But today you must be my sword. Go." With a growl torn from the depths of his soul, Callen obeyed, carving a bloody path through the enemy ranks, the Heartstone clutched tight against his chest. The journey to the wellspring was a gauntlet of death, every street a battleground, every corner a potential grave. He was wounded again, a deep gash across his thigh, but he did not falter, driven by a singular purpose. Finally, battered and bleeding, he reached the ancient well at the heart of the city, a massive, crumbling edifice etched with forgotten runes. He plunged the Heartstone into the waters, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground shuddered, and from the depths of the well rose a blinding surge of light that raced through the city like wildfire. The suns faltered, screaming as the very stones rebelled against them, walls shifting and reshaping, tendrils of pure energy lashing out to strike them down. Velmora itself had awakened to defend its queen. Callen staggered back to the sanctum, half delirious, and found Ceres still standing, though barely, her sword red to the hilt. Their eyes met across the carnage, and she smiled, a radiant, exhausted smile that lit the ruins brighter than any sun. The battle was over. The suns routed, their rebellion crushed beneath the weight of a hope they had underestimated. In the aftermath, there were countless dead to mourn, wounds to bind, a city to rebuild from the rubble. But there was also life, and in that life, a future. Ceres and Callen stood together atop the broken steps of the palace, looking out over their battered but unbowed people. She reached for his hand, not as queen to servant, but as woman to man, and he took it without hesitation. They had both been remade by fire and blood, forged into something stronger than they had ever been alone. Together they would heal Velmora. Together, they would dream. And Callen Voss, once a mercenary adrift in the void, now stood as the queen's shield, her chosen, her beloved, the man who had stepped into death for her and in doing so had found life beyond anything he had ever dared imagine.